Hello, I'm Dr. Ron England coming to you from Daytona State College. And this is part one of a series of lectures on creating a dynamic form management software. And I call this software FormaDillo. And it is what it says it is. This is a software that allows you to go through a web interface, create forms, publish those forms, and then make them available to users and then collect the data from those forms. You've seen things like this before if you've looked at FormStack, Wufoo, or SurveyMonkey for that matter. So a little bit of background. If you have not looked at the self-saving object architecture lectures, which outline the class that I've created, XML property object, it's probably a good idea to go look at that because this builds on top of that architecture. It allows me to do this relatively simply. But the objective here is really straightforward. I want to be able to have a software where users can go to a web browser, create a form, publish the form, and collect and manage the data from those forms. So the architecture here is really straightforward. The concept of a form is just what you'd think it would be. It is a form like you would see on a piece of paper, but forms can get relatively lengthy. So I've broken up the concept of the form into multiple pages so that when you are displaying the form in a browser, the form can let you flip through page after page. Okay, even though the form pages themselves all pertain to data that is associated with a single thing. Okay, if it's a form where you're collecting data about a person, that thing would be the person. Okay, but the concept is similar. You have a single primary key or primary element that is what the form is about in multiple pages to collect it. And then form elements, which is the next level down, is dealing with specific individual elements on that form, such as text boxes or check boxes or drop-down lists. So let's talk a little bit about those. So here's some examples of some form elements, and FormaDillo right now supports these elements: label, text box, checkbox, drop-down list, and checkbox lists. And I have a showing here too. But a form element is actually a little bit more. So like for a text box, it actually includes the prompt and the text box itself. In the case of a checkbox list, it includes the prompt, the individual value choices that you can have, and you can also have the values that are selected. So let's look a little bit at this class. Form element, and form page all have their own separate class. Notice that the class does not deal with the data, it just deals with the form itself. So for the form element class, we have it inherited from XML property object, and we have, in this case, the prompt, and there's two prompts, form prompt and report prompt. So the form prompt could say enter name, whereas the report prompt would be what you'd see on a report, which is just say name. Also, some properties would be the type, because you need to know whether this form element is a text box or a drop-down list. Any of those 5 types that I actually talked about earlier. Width, you can allow it to set a custom width. For drop-down lists and checkbox lists, you actually have multiple values that need to be displayed in those types of elements. So you have a list of strings called values, and then you have a default value so that if you want to default to one of them, you can. Column. Column is designed so that you can have a multi-column layout for form pages. So in other words, you can have up to 3 columns. And then you have the ability to customize applying a custom CSS class to both the label and the element, which is held in the form element class. So a form page would look something like this, and this has got custom CSS applied to each form element. So you have the name, and then you have the text box, that's the label, and then the element itself. You have a label, gender, and in this case it's a drop-down list, a label with a style applied, and a checkbox list. Another example would be one with like multiple drop-down lists, let's say yes, no. Okay. Any other options? I mean, we haven't done radio button lists, but it would be relatively easy to add new form elements. And that was the whole concept of the design, to allow you to add multiple form elements if you had ones that you wanted to have that aren't that don't already exist. That's why it's open source, and that's why you have access to the code. Now, we have to put these form elements together, and to do that, we put them together in a form page. The first property, which is title, which, by the way, there's the title, medical issues, diagnoses is a title. You have a property that actually stores its values in another property. It stores its values in description, which is something that it inherits from XML property object, the base class. You have the ability to put form instructions on the page. You have a CSS class that you can have there. You can also have a target platform, so you can design for a phone, tablet, or computer, and the number of columns. So basic properties associated with the form page are shown right here. Now let's look a little bit at some code. Let's first think about what the code's got to do if I want to create that form. Well, I need to have a collection of form elements. I need to get all those form elements that are going to be on the page. So to do that, the form element has to have the ability to return itself as a control. The form page needs to be able to put those elements together and then display them. So let's kind of look into the basics of how this would occur. Okay, now going back one more step, realize that forms can contain multiple pages, but we're really only looking at the display of a single form page at once. So if a form page can display itself, you've got the top level capability of what you need to do to have a form management software. So let's go all the way down to the level of a form element. Well, the form element must have a number of methods to return itself as an actual object that can be displayed on a page. And inside the C# language, which is what this is written in, okay, we're simply going to return a text box, okay, for a form element that's a text box. But the text box itself does have two pieces. It has the label and the text box itself. So here we have the code that basically says, you know what, let's get the text box itself, okay, and be able to return ourselves as a text box. So there's the width. If it has a value, it returns the value, and value is passed to it. That is the data value. And the CSS class that's associated with it. So in other words, it can apply a CSS class to the text box, okay, and it has an ID, and it has the value which actually goes into the text. So the form element can answer itself answer the text box associated with the form element. The form page in this program, in FormaDillo, what it does is it creates a table. And then it creates rows for each of the individual pieces or every element that's in that table. And in the row, it has two cells. One cell contains the label, which is what I'm doing right here. So in other words, all this code here is simply to determine what that cell, which has the label, is going to have there. And it's real simple because once you've created the cell, you simply add the cells to the table row. Okay, so I create the table row, I create the cell, I put all the stuff I want in the cell, and then I add the cell to the table row. And then the next cell is going to go ahead and be created. Okay, that's another cell. And I'm going to add a text box, which is the text box that was created in the code that you saw earlier, and I'm going to add that to the cell, and I'm going to add the cell to the row. So whereas I add the text box to the cell, the control collection of the cell, and I add the cell to the row, and voila, I have a beautiful table that displays the form. So the form page display methods has the capability and the responsibility of putting all the table rows together into a table, and then it can pass this entire table over to a placeholder. So all I really actually need, okay, to be able to display this is a form, an actual web form in C# that I can put this placeholder onto and then add this to that placeholder, and I have a form. Now, that is all I have for part 1, but you can kind of see where we're going and the architecture, the big architectural concept of how this is going to work. The next thing we're going to talk about in part 2 is how we're going to manage the data, because the concept of a form is that you have to be able to collect and then display data. And you have to be able to display data that already exists. In other words, you have to be able to populate the form with data, allow you to update the form, allow you to insert the data into the background tables. Okay, and then what I mean by tables here is database tables, and be able to do all of this dynamically. And that's the big challenge with this. But it really isn't as hard as you might think. Even though it does get into some relatively complex coding, it isn't that bad. So hopefully you understood this one, and you'll be looking forward to part 2. And for everyone that's following my programming series, good programming, and I should, within the next couple of months, shortly, have the entire code project out and available as an open source. Thanks very much.